U.S. President Donald Trump is warning of an economic and national security disaster if the Supreme Court overturns its use of emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs on nearly every country. Speaking Monday, Trump claimed the tariffs have generated trillions in tariff and investment income.
The numbers were reported so incorrectly. The real numbers are trillions of dollars have been taken in or gotten in terms of investment from the tariffs.
Trump had previously floated the idea of using tariff revenues to pay for what he calls a dividend to lower-earning Americans, and repeated his plans on Monday.
We're going to issue a dividend to our middle-income people and lower-income people of about $2,000, and we're going to use the remaining tariffs to lower our debt.
During last week's oral arguments on the tariff case, Supreme Court justices cast doubt on Trump's authority to impose tariffs under the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which contains no references to tariffs. Justice Amy Coney Barrett suggested it could be a mess for the courts to administer refunds to U.S. importers who have paid tariffs that were declared illegal. Trump took issue with media reports about the amount of duties collected that the government might have to repay if the Supreme Court agrees with a lower court that Trump's sweeping tariffs were illegal.
So they're not giving the right numbers. It would be...
Folks, the Supreme Court just heard arguments in what could be the most consequential case about presidential power in decades, and Donald Trump's entire economic legacy is hanging in the balance. We're talking about a landmark legal showdown that could either give Trump and future presidents virtually unlimited power to reshape the economy with the stroke of a pen, or it could slam the brakes on executive overreach in a way that fundamentally changes how America is governed. On November 5th, 2025, the highest court in the land heard arguments in the consolidated case of Learning Resources versus Trump and Trump versus VOS Selections Incorporated, and the questions being asked by the justices sent shockwaves through both Wall Street and Washington. This isn't just about tariffs or trade policy. This is about whether a president can declare an emergency and then use that declaration to bypass Congress entirely, imposing massive economic changes that affect every single American without any legislative approval. The lower courts have already ruled that Trump's tariffs exceeded presidential authority and violated constitutional limits, permanently blocking their enforcement. But now the Supreme Court gets the final say, and their decision could reshape the balance of power in American government for generations to come. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
An economic disaster. It would be a national security disaster if we lost the case in the Supreme Court.
It remains unclear exactly when the highest court will rule and whether companies will be entitled to refunds of more than $100 billion in IEEPA tariffs paid so far if Trump loses. The tariff debate comes as Trump's poll numbers have slipped in recent months, with growing public frustration over inflation and economic uncertainty, driving voters toward Democrats in recent elections. Yet Trump hailed what he called a decline in inflation since he took office, arguing that food prices and energy prices were coming down and inflation would be down to 1.5%, quote, pretty soon. But government data shows tariffs continue to push up costs for everyday goods, from clothing and furniture to appliances and sporting gear. Consumer prices rose 3% in the year through September, slightly higher than the previous month.
Astronomical, both financially and constitutionally. We're talking about up to $130 billion in tariff refunds that the government might have to pay back to U.S. importers if the Supreme Court upholds the lower court ruling. That's billion with a B. Money that Trump collected through what judges have already determined were illegal tariffs imposed without proper authority. But even more important than the money is the precedent this case will set. If the Supreme Court sides with Trump, it would mean that any president can essentially declare an economic emergency and then remake entire sectors of the economy without going through Congress. They could impose tariffs, sanctions, trade restrictions, or virtually any economic policy they want just by saying the magic words national emergency. On the flip side, if the court rules against Trump, it would establish a powerful new check on presidential power, telling current and future presidents that there are limits to what they can do unilaterally, even in supposed emergencies. What makes this case so explosive is that the justices themselves seem deeply skeptical of Trump's claims to near unchecked power during oral arguments. They questioned whether the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known as IEEPA, really gives presidents the authority to bypass Congress in setting trade tariffs. Justice after justice pressed Trump's lawyers on where exactly in the Constitution or federal law they found this sweeping authority to fundamentally restructure international trade without congressional approval. The government's attorneys struggled to provide satisfactory answers, and court watchers noted that even some of the conservative justices appointed by Trump himself seemed uncomfortable with the breadth of power the administration was claiming. This skepticism from the bench suggests that Trump might be facing a crushing defeat that would not only invalidate his tariffs, but also severely limit his ability to take unilateral economic actions in the future. Let's really dig into the legal arguments and understand why this case is such a big deal for the future of American democracy. The core issue revolves around the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law passed in 1977 that gives presidents certain powers to deal with unusual and extraordinary threats to national security, foreign policy, or the economy. Trump used this law to impose sweeping tariffs on imports from around the world, claiming that trade deficits and foreign competition constituted a national emergency that justified bypassing Congress. But here's the problem. EPA was never intended to give presidents the power to completely remake trade policy on their own. It was meant for actual emergencies like freezing assets of terrorist organizations or responding to immediate threats, not for implementing long-term economic policies that Congress has specifically chosen not to enact. The lower court ruling that's now under Supreme Court review was absolutely devastating for Trump's position. On May 28, 2025, a federal court permanently barred Trump's tariffs, with the judge writing that the president may not claim unlimited authority under IEEPA for trade policy. The court found that Trump had essentially hijacked an emergency powers law to do something that clearly required congressional approval, fundamentally restructuring America's trade relationships with the entire world. The judge noted that if presidents could use IEEPA this way, it would make Congress's constitutional power over interstate and international commerce meaningless. Why would Congress need to pass trade legislation if the president could just declare an emergency and do whatever they wanted? This ruling sent shockwaves through the Trump administration because it didn't just block one specific tariff. It challenged the entire legal theory underlying Trump's trade war. During the Supreme Court oral arguments, the justices zeroed in on a crucial question. Where does presidential emergency power end and congressional authority begin? Trump's lawyers argued that in matters of national security and economic emergencies, the president needs broad flexibility to act quickly without waiting for Congress to debate and pass legislation. They painted a picture of a dangerous world where America's economic competitors could exploit any delay in presidential action. But the lawyers challenging the tariffs had a powerful counter-argument. They pointed out that Trump had been imposing these emergency tariffs for years, which hardly seemed like an emergency requiring immediate action. If something is truly an emergency, they argued, you don't have time to carefully structure tariffs to protect certain industries while punishing others, negotiate exemptions for specific companies, and maintain the policy for years on end. That's not emergency action. That's legislative policymaking, which is Congress's job. The constitutional implications of this case extend far beyond just Trump and his tariffs. Legal analysts and constitutional scholars are describing this decision as a crossroads for presidential power that will affect every future administration. If the Supreme Court upholds Trump's broad interpretation of emergency powers, it would essentially create a loophole that would allow presidents to bypass Congress on almost any economic issue. Future presidents could declare emergencies based on climate change, income inequality, healthcare costs, or any other economic concern, and then use those declarations to implement sweeping policies without legislative approval. This would fundamentally alter the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches, concentrating enormous power in the hands of one person. On the other hand, if the court strikes down Trump's tariffs and limits presidential emergency powers, it would reinforce Congress's role as the primary maker of economic policy and ensure that major economic decisions require democratic debate and legislative approval. The potential economic fallout from this Supreme Court decision is keeping Wall Street traders and corporate executives up at night. If the court rules against Trump, we're not just talking about stopping future tariffs. We're talking about potentially unwinding years of trade policy and refunding up to $130 billion in tariffs that have already been collected. Companies that paid these tariffs could be entitled to massive refunds, which would blow a huge hole in the federal budget and force the government to essentially admit that it illegally collected billions from American businesses. The ripple effects would be felt throughout the global economy, as trade relationships that have been restructured around Trump's tariffs would suddenly have to be recalculated. Stock markets would likely see massive volatility as investors try to figure out which companies would benefit from refunds and which would be hurt by the sudden change in trade policy. But the economic impacts pale in comparison to the political earthquake this decision could trigger, especially with the 2024 election cycle in full swing. Trump has made his tariff policy a centerpiece of his economic message, claiming that he used his business expertise and negotiating skills to protect American workers from unfair foreign competition. If the Supreme Court rules that his signature economic policy was illegal all along, it would be a devastating blow to his political brand and his claim to be a strong leader who gets things done. Democrats would have a field day pointing out that Trump's main economic achievement was just struck down as unconstitutional overreach. Meanwhile, Republicans who supported the tariffs would have to explain why they backed a policy that the Supreme Court determined was illegal. The decision could reshape the entire election narrative, forcing Trump to defend his leadership style and his understanding of constitutional limits, just as voters are making their final decisions. The timing of this decision couldn't be more critical for American democracy and the rule of law. We're at a moment when democratic norms and institutions are under unprecedented strain, when the balance of power between branches of government is being constantly tested, and when the American people are deeply divided about how much power the president should have. The Supreme Court's decision in this case will send a powerful signal about whether we're moving toward a system with an increasingly powerful executive who can act unilaterally on major issues, or whether we're recommitting to the constitutional principle of separated powers with real checks and balances. Legal experts are watching closely because they know this decision will be cited for decades to come whenever questions arise about the limits of presidential power. Looking at the broader pattern of Trump's presidency and post-presidency, this tariff case fits perfectly into his consistent push to expand executive power beyond traditional limits. From declaring a national emergency to build the border wall without congressional funding, to claiming absolute immunity from criminal prosecution, to asserting the right to declassify documents just by thinking about it, Trump has consistently argued for an almost monarchical view of presidential power. The tariff case represents perhaps the most economically significant example of this pattern, affecting billions of dollars in trade and the prices Americans pay for countless products. If the Supreme Court rejects this expansion of power, it would be a clear statement that even Trump-appointed justices recognize there are limits to what a president can do without congressional approval. The international implications of this case are also massive and often overlooked. America's trading partners have been watching this legal challenge closely, wondering whether they need to prepare for a world where U.S. presidents can unilaterally impose tariffs whenever they want, or whether they can rely on the stability of congressional oversight. If the Supreme Court upholds Trump's authority, other countries might respond by giving their own leaders similar emergency powers, leading to a global trade system where executives can start trade wars at will without legislative approval. This could destabilize the entire international economic order, making long-term trade agreements nearly impossible and increasing economic uncertainty worldwide. On the other hand, if the court strikes down the tariffs, it would reassure global partners that America remains committed to the rule of law and that trade policy will continue to be made through democratic processes rather than executive decree. As we wait for the Supreme Court's decision, which could come any day now, it's worth reflecting on what this case says about the state of American democracy. We have a former president who imposed massive economic changes through emergency declarations, lower courts that said this was illegal, and now the highest court in the land wrestling with fundamental questions about the separation of powers. This is exactly how the system is supposed to work. When one branch of government overreaches, the others step in to restore balance. But the fact that we're having this debate at all, that a president felt empowered to bypass Congress so brazenly, and that it's taken years of litigation to resolve the question, shows how fragile our democratic safeguards can be. The Supreme Court's decision will tell us a lot about where America is headed. Will we continue down a path toward ever-expanding executive power, where presidents can reshape major policies through emergency declarations? Or will we reassert the principle that major economic decisions affecting millions of Americans require the involvement of their elected representatives in Congress? Will we have a system where one person can impose billions in taxes on imported goods with the stroke of a pen? Or will we maintain that the power to tax and regulate commerce belongs to the legislative branch? These aren't just abstract constitutional questions. They're about who decides how much you pay for goods at the store, whether American businesses can compete fairly, and ultimately whether we remain a democracy where major decisions require democratic input or become something closer to an elected dictatorship where the president can do almost anything by declaring an emergency. The Supreme Court holds the answer, and their decision will echo through American history for generations to come.